Yeah, we might have some more people filtering in here, but I might be worth getting started. Just for our time, I know we want to, I said we always run to time with our Q&A, so we can see what happens today. But yeah, Ulrich, you'll introduce Brett, but I'll just say a few words about the center. So this is the Center for Religion and Global Citizenry. Ulrich's our director. I coordinate programs. I get these. Well, Brett was just complimenting me on the emails and we have a bit of programming. So we obviously are running this interdisciplinary religion group, showcasing graduate students, faculty, but also former graduate students and former IRG folks like Brett, to kind of share ongoing research, things that they're working on, get feedback and questions, and kind of building community amongst scholars here at UW. So happy to do that. A bigger program, the main thing we've been doing is this undergraduate fellowship, which maybe some of you are familiar with, students from different religious and no religious backgrounds coming together for a dialogue. So that takes up a lot of our time. But happy to have Brett here today. Ulrich, you want to say a few words about our speaker?
Okay, so I actually thought I have to be a little formal, so bear with me. Happy to introduce Brett Bertucio, recent UW medicine PhD, who is now an assistant professor of education at Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas. And you just told me where you ended up, what neck of the woods that is. Brett has been a crucial force at the beginnings of the IRG. He drafted one of the first blurbs and connected the center with Professor Sam Rocha, British Columbia, for the very first IRG presentation and discussion. So he goes way back with the IRG. I'm really glad to have a chance today to finally thank Brett publicly for his involvement and great support of the center. So thank you, Brett. Not forgotten. Thank you so much. So.
Wow, thank you, Ulrich. That's really kind and generous. And I have to say, I remember being invited to it was then called the Lubar Forum for discussion, and it's a beautiful experience. And then starting the IRG, someone else had put it, sometimes at Wisconsin, when you study religion across any discipline, you feel like the only penguin at the zoo. And so this is a place to get all the penguins together, and it was really, really wonderful. And I think, just enormously grateful to Ulrich and Eric for kind of your mentorship as I went along in the program, and to David, who I think I don't think we've met in person, but I'm just so impressed that at the kind of health of the IRG and that it took off, and there's people who are interested. So I want to kind of share my screen here. And
I'm not done. I'm not done.
You're not done? My goodness, let me stop.
I want to say, to my regret, I missed the defense of his dissertation. His doctor mother is with us, Simone. I even wrote down the title, but it's a long title, From Courtroom to Classroom, Church, State, and American Civil Education, 1940 to 1980, the long period. To my delight, however, we have Brett now with us to give a presentation here, or his presentation at the IRG. I have a little more, but you're eager to get going.
Oh, so. No, I don't mean to jump in front.
Formal stuff. It's okay. Just, these Germans, they're always formal. So let's just scratch that. Please welcome with me, Brett Bertucio. Brett, the floor is yours, or the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ulrich. I think, as an American, I think I could do with a little more formality in my academic life. Here we go. We usually don't, get up in dress in our academic regalia as the Brits do, or have formal introductions as I guess the Germans do, and maybe we should. I wanted to share certainly about my dissertation, but kind of some methodological questions and theoretical questions that I dealt with, and I would say I'm still dealing with, and maybe I'll just go through kind of the plan of what I want to think about today. So I suppose it sounds like David's our graduate student on the call, but I imagine if everyone ever watches this recording, or folks, hopefully, more senior folks can take one tiny, maybe this will be a provocation as they do their own research. I won't say insight. But so I want to kind of go through the origins of my project and to think about some of the theoretical choices I had to make and methodological choices I had to make. And of course, the upshot is that I defended 6 months ago, and the hope is that this dissertation project turns into a first monograph. So I'm still kind of struggling with some questions about sourcing, method, and a little bit of theory. So I'd love to have a conversation when I've said my piece. So I just a kind of plan of the day, I want to talk about how my questions came up, then trying to think about the necessary reductions to get them to something that was researchable. And certainly that's a typical process that every graduate student goes through, but I think it was interesting to think about when I study, if you're studying religion or people's held religious beliefs, what kind of interesting wrinkles are involved. Talk about I chose to use a framework of political theology, kind of an old and yet new field of discourse, and think about the strengths and weaknesses of that. And then some kind of ethical implications about trying to, I call it theologically profiling dead people. I'm trying to pin ideas or diagnose historical actors' ideas about their own religious beliefs, which they may or may not claim for themselves or admit to. It's maybe a more specific question of the broader question: how do I have a synthesis of someone's ideas if they might disagree with my synthesis? And of course, that gets complicated even more so if you're dealing with live people who are participants and in some ways co-researchers in your project. So I did a little bit of oral history, and I'll talk about some episodes of that. And I wanted to end and then hopefully kind of to start discussion, some big methodological and theoretical questions that came up as I was working through this and still working through this and thinking through this, and then talk a little bit about where I'm hoping to go with this work and some decisions I have to make, and hopefully it's a fruitful conversation. So we'll start kind of with how this question came to be. So I want to say that this was, I came to Madison in 2014. So sometime in my second or third year, I had come to Madison in part because I was teaching at a high school, a private high school that had no sort of pressure from any sort of district or state forces, but just was enamored with standardized testing. And I really wanted to know why we were so interested, if it wasn't forced upon us. So I came in part to work with Bill Reese, who had just written a great book on the origin of standardized testing in America. And so that was my initial intention. And then along the way, certainly I'm a religious person by background and commitment, and had taught in Catholic schools. And so was interested about the testing, got me interested in law and policy, and was reading kind of some First Amendment jurisprudence related to schools. And so I came across this decision in 1947. It's Everson v. Board of Education. And basically what happens is there's this township in New Jersey, and they're employing the state law that says the state can reimburse families of kids to go to private school for their bus fare. They take the public buses to these private schools. And so the question is, does this offend the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment that says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion? Is the state essentially aiding monetarily kids to go to religious schools, and therefore somehow offending the Constitution. And it was a narrow decision. The court said it's okay. Robert Jackson in dissent has this wild phrase, and I was just fixated on it. And he says, our public school, if not a product of Protestantism, at least is more consistent with it than with the Catholic culture and scheme of values. The thing to know is that almost all the schools in this township in New Jersey that were not public were Catholic parochial schools. So de facto, this was a program that helped kids go to Catholic schools. Since the public school is a relatively recent development, that's a fair date, 1840, organized on the premise that secular education can be isolated from all religious teaching, so the school can inculcate all needed temporal knowledge and maintain a strict and lofty neutrality as to religion, the assumption being that after the individual has been instructed in worldly wisdom, he'll be better fitted to choose his religion. I was just struck by the fact that, one, in a case where we're trying to say that government should be in some sense religiously neutral, Jackson admits, which historically is fairly true, if not contemporarily, that's another question, that the public schools in America are in many ways Protestant institutions, at least of their origin. But then that he says the normative ideal is that students get, or young people are given secular knowledge, and then at a certain point they come of age, and then they can choose their religion. And in 1947, I think, is an empirical statement. This would not be the norm for a kid growing up in America. They would most likely be inculcated into whatever religious values that their parents held. And then as a normative statement, it struck me that it's quite interesting to say that a young person should not be introduced to or inculcated into a religious tradition. So that just got me kind of set off on all these First Amendment cases dealing with schools. And then, as all kind of good ideas do, it really came to fruition while I was in a Wisconsin football game. So a classmate had invited me, had an extra ticket to a game, and we're standing in the student section. And of course, all the undergraduates are very attentive about the game and cheering, etc. And we were just talking about our coursework and our research. My classmate asked me, what are you thinking about doing? I said, well, I'm reading a lot about the religion clauses of the First Amendment in schools, and I'm kind of interested in the history of that. And she says, oh, do you mean the separation of church and state? And I had just read barely enough to know that, of course, this is a phrase of Thomas Jefferson interpreting the Establishment Clause, and that it's at least fairly contentious in the jurisprudence and in legal commentary, so not necessarily a universal interpretation. And the fact that she said it so kind of matter-of-factly, and then thinking back to my own education, this phrase was used in textbooks from middle school on. I wanted to ask essentially where our ideas come from. Certainly we kind of know historically that Jefferson's interpretation didn't come into common parlance or into even kind of the legal field until 1897. We have this case, US v. Reynolds, about whether polygamy in the then federal territory of Utah is permissible. And the Chief Justice, who writes the majority opinion, his neighbor is a historian researching James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, and so kind of pulls this phrase from Jefferson. So it kind of gets its way into the legal sphere, but I'm really interested in, I knew enough to know it's not directly from the Constitution. I was really interested in how we got to this place where in some circles of American life, that was simply a normative interpretation or a synonymous phrase with the First Amendment. And then in some circles of religious life, it was not. And this was 2016, and the 2016 presidential election was certainly bizarre. And I started to formulate my dissertation project when there was kind of some lead up to the 2020 election. And within 2 or 3 months of each other, we had a couple moments. Pete Buttigieg, when he was running as a candidate for the Democratic nomination, commenting on treatment of migrants at the southern border, said something, and some administrative appointee had said something to the effect that the Bible tells us that these people are lawbreakers, they're quote unquote illegal immigrants, and so good Christians can or even should be stopping them at the border. And Pete Buttigieg says something to the effect of Democrats don't like to use the language of religion in the public sphere because we believe in the separation of church and state. But if Republicans use it in this manner, they should be banned from using all religious language ever again. And it's interesting to think, well, we shouldn't use religious language, but if we do, there's certain religious criteria for it. A few months later, then the Attorney General William Barr is speaking at the Notre Dame Law School and essentially channels and cites George Washington to the effect of, we cannot have a functioning liberal democracy without religious ideas informing the public sphere. Just the year prior, we had and I'm sure in 20 years, we're gonna be reading history books about this moment when now Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett was going through a confirmation hearing for the Seventh Circuit, and Dianne Feinstein utters these famous words. I'm essentially nervous about her Catholic identity because, quote unquote, the dogma lives loudly within you. So this question of whether kind of adherence to certain religious commitments are appropriate in the public sphere. And just as I was getting my proposal together, the #1 selling album was Kanye West's Jesus is King, the most political and religious kind of mashup that you could imagine. And just as an aside, when I was an undergrad, Kanye West was first starting out, and he came and performed at my university. And I never could have imagined decades later that this person would be, I looked it up last night, the musician with the largest net worth in history, and someone with the most bizarre politics maybe in recent memory. So anyway, all these things were kind of stirring my mind. And the bizarre thing of kind of about the political sphere was that our dialogue was certainly and undeniably incommensurate. And that's kind of a phrase from Alistair McIntyre, meaning we seem to be talking about the same questions, but our language as Americans is so divergent that we're not even sharing concepts. We can't have what we might call a dialogue. We're simply having kind of a shouting match. And so how did we get to a place where our ideas about the proper relationship between religious life, political and civic life are so divorced from each other? And so I kind of had two questions. One was, where does the average Joe, like myself, my classmate, where do they get their ideas about this? And second, reading all these Supreme Court opinions, where do elite actors get their ideas about these? And the B question is pretty straightforward. We can do intellectual biography. It's been done well. People who are important or think they are important leave us their personal papers. And lots of people talk to them and write to them. And so that's possible. But question A was a little bit more difficult. And so by necessity, I had to think, well, I can't really get to that question. And maybe at heart, that's what will drive my intellectual curiosity throughout my career or my life. But as an academic pursuit, it's maybe not possible. I certainly couldn't, I was really interested in a massive intellectual genealogy. How did everyone in the country get their ideas about a thing? Of course, I can't know that. I can't do survey research in the past. I'm sure there's kind of like a short story or sci-fi movie about that. And then even thinking where do our ideas come from is so difficult. We can imagine in this question, what's the proper role of religious and political life in a person's life and in a society? You think sources of ideas from your family, religious communities, mass media, political rhetoric, and even formal education, which I was in a school of education and am in a school of education, very interested in that, but nailing down kind of a source of ideas was too hard. So I thought, well, you can't kind of drill into someone's head, especially someone who has passed, and understand what they're thinking. So where do the ideas of average people show up in the historical record? Well, not very much, but only in written words and actions. So I don't know, it's in many ways impossible to know what people were thinking, but it's more possible to know what people were taught, what others wanted them to think, what kind of relatively more elite actors were interested in communicating. And still that's kind of too big. And so I decided to focus on what were adolescents taught, in this case, high school kids, and in one segment of their lives, it is formal education. And so kind of providentially, looking through the historical record, there was an opportunity to study a small slice of this question. So in the mid 20th century, kind of beginning right before Earl Warren is appointed as Supreme Court or the Chief Justice, we have a lot of moments that we could call a constitutional crisis. We have the Little Rock moment and kind of mass resistance over desegregation. We have a lot of questioning about free speech in the McCarthy era. And then I would argue that kind of the levee breaks in 1962 when the court rules as unconstitutional. This headline says outlaws, but rules as unconstitutional official prayer in public schools. And also that term, the court hears this case about political redistricting or gerrymandering. And Felix Frankfurter kind of cautions the court not to weigh into some of these controversies, saying, we have no means of enforcement other than to convince the citizenry somehow that what we say is true and right and just. And so our power just rests on public opinion, essentially. And right before this decision was handed down, Paul Freund, who's a law professor at Harvard, had written a book, essentially an apologetics for the Warren Court. It was a popular book to say, in so many words, these are the reasons why the Warren Court is getting it right. And Harold Burton on the court wrote to him to thank him, and he said, these are the kinds of efforts from people in the academy and education and TV and news media that we need. The court needs this kind of publicity work or an educational work. So luckily for some of the justices, immediately following the Engel v. Vitale decision in '62, that's a decision that rules as unconstitutional official prayers in public schools, a rather ambitious educational entrepreneur, Minna Post-Pizer, moves to found a national organization for civic education, particularly about the Constitution. And so in the summer of '62, she starts the National Assembly for Teaching the Principles of the Bill of Rights, which is an awful name for an organization. I don't even know, the acronym doesn't make sense or sound well. Fortunately, it would turn into a permanent, kind of a semi-permanent research center at Columbia in a few years. And so she essentially wanted to look at what high school students were learning about the Constitution, to design better curricula, and to train teachers to teach it. And interestingly, kind of a who's who of people in were maybe more progressively minded signed on to this idea, including William Brennan and William Douglas, who were then on the Supreme Court. And really interesting, when Thurgood Marshall was a circuit court judge, I think at the 10th Circuit, he also jumped onto this project. So the idea for Pizer, as well as for the court, is to use civic education as a lever for public opinion, essentially to get Americans to not be so angry at the court, to believe that the court's jurisprudence was the authentic interpretation of the Constitution and should be obeyed and not resisted. And so immediately within the next 2 or 3 years, we get 2 of the Supreme Court justices who are officially associated with this organization that kind of jumpstarts a movement in civic education that we later started to call law-related education. So to educate students, mostly high school students, about American law. And initially the movement was primarily concerned with constitutional law. So 2 justices intimately involved, and 3, Abe Fortas, Earl Warren, and Thurgood Marshall, who on occasion would lend their support, whether that's financially, publicly, kind of making appearances, or endorsing these sorts of civic education materials. So this was just the kind of the genesis of my dissertation work. I was really interested in how adolescents, so high school kids, were taught to think or asked to think about the religion clauses of the First Amendment within this curricular movement that kind of had ebbed and flowed, and at certain points was fairly influential in the field of social studies education, and at other points was not. So really looking at the origin of ideas, so trying to do some sort of genealogical work, both on the court side of elite actors, and then on the side of, on the right-hand side here, curriculum developers who are thinking about how do we present what the court is saying to kids to create curricular materials that hopefully would wind up in the minds and hearts of American youth. So just briefly, it's a little less interesting than some of the kind of methodological ideas I have to make. My argument basically was that the first generation of this curricular movement, the people, the curriculum developers involved, are ideologically sympathetic to the court, and their curriculum is fairly didactic, presenting students with the idea that these interpretations are authoritative and correct, and they should be embraced without much question. A decade goes by, and while the kind of ideological tenor of the curriculum developers does not change, and the personnel does not change much, the American politics in the court changes. Nixon gets elected, and within 3 years is able to remake the court. And certainly Reagan's election in 1980 really kind of solidifies this. And so we have a court that is divided on a lot of these issues. And we have curriculum developers in a place where they can no longer claim that, in good conscience, claim that the court is getting things right. And so I argue that this was the impetus to develop what we kind of curricula that treats these questions at open controversies for students to debate and decide for themselves. And so my argument is that this is one origin of what we now call controversial issues discussion, which is a kind of a pedagogical technique or school that's fairly popular. And our dean at the School of Education, Diana Hess, is one of the foremost researchers in this sort of pedagogy for contemporary students. So my argument was basically this weird confluence of political and religious diversity or divergence creates a pedagogical strategy, which I hope is interesting. But for the purposes of our discussion, I want to get into kind of how do I treat the religious aspect? And I think if I had a critique of contemporary curricula, it's that I would believe that kind of presenting students with open controversies is a great pedagogical technique for a democratic society. Often I feel that the way things are presented to students is the disagreement is on the level of an outcome of a certain particular case. How should the court rule in this case? What should a community do in this case? But left unaddressed is kind of the root of the disagreement, which is, I would say, at the basis of ideological and even religious or theological disagreement. So knowing that, or actually being convinced of that, I made a theoretical choice. And that was to frame much of my work in terms of the field of political theology. And certainly political theology is not not new, but it's also I would say be refreshed in a way. So we can look to the book of Samuel, at least in the West, all the major the three monotheistic religious traditions. We can say engage in some way in political theology. The book of Samuel is really God talking to the prophet Samuel about the theological consequences of the people of Israel's demand for an earthly king. Within early Christians thought, certainly the question of how does Christian soteriology and ecclesiology fit into the Roman Empire. And we think with Islam, kind of much of hadiths and much of the Sunnah are in many ways intentionally and in other ways inescapably political. So these things are not new, but what is new is kind of Anglophone reception of this field as a field of thought. And it really traces back to kind of the translation and reception of a German theorist who has like a very interesting relationship with the Nazi Party, Carl Schmitt. But his insight is basically that what we take to be ostensibly secular concepts about political organization or religiously neutral concepts are themselves at their origin actually theological concepts that are repurposed for the public sphere. So that's kind of set off this wave of scholarship. And you ask what is political theology, and you can give a lot of different answers. And Eric Gregory gives kind of a nice typology of different kinds. So we can think about, well, are religious people trying to influence politics? How does that happen? Mark Lilla or Lila, I'm not sure to pronounce the name, at Columbia does this quite often. We can, like Schmitt, investigate the theological underpinnings of political theory. Say, well, here's a essentially simply political idea. What are actually its origins in a religious sense? Think about almost the opposite, political evidence for explicitly theological aims. How do political movements affect our understanding of salvation history? Maybe a term from particularly Christianity. And then simply kind of empirical investigations of when people live their lives, do they live separate political and religious lives, or are those intertwined? And I kind of found most convincing this essentially Schmittian approach, as taken up by contemporary theorists, particularly Paul Kahn, who's a law prof at NYU. And his kind of synthesis of Schmitt's insight is that the modern democratic liberal state purports to be a secular arrangement, or attempts to be at least, but that's either impossible or simply not happening. So I think there's maybe a lot of interesting problems with this, and certainly problems that accompany any sort of embrace of theory when you do historical work. But I think there's, some interesting wrinkles in the context of studying religion. And so, of course, the kind of classic danger is if all I have is a hammer, if I think every idea about politics has at its origin a theological idea, do I just think that everything everyone does is religious? And actually, I'm going to say yes. And it's kind of a methodological decision born from some anthropological commitments that I have and observations. Thought, as a graduate student observing the political scene, I'm interested in civic education in 2016 and 2020. I think our disagreements were at heart religious, even if they wouldn't be named that. And I think that the modern category of religion, even if it's truncated, best describes a lot of the way people think about ultimate questions and the meaning of their life. And those things are really inseparable from politics. So maybe there's a danger that I'm blinded to nuance, or kind of putting my finger down too hard on one perspective, but that'd be an interesting thing to talk about in the Q&A here. So let's think about kind of some dangers of doing that with dead people. So first of all, I went about looking through the court's jurisprudence and trying to say, and the justices' personal papers, and trying to say, well, what are the religious influences on their political thought? And this kind of project has been done before, but I want to say that in my moment, I did a little bit more archival research than others had done before. But there's kind of a hint actually in the record that this is a fine approach. Jackson says in a case the following year, following Everson, he says, we really don't know what we're doing here. There's no real good precedents. So we're just ruling according to our own prepossessions. So I felt, at least a warrant to go through this. And maybe the most interesting part of going through the archives was discovering that at one point, 3 of the 9 justices on the court are all going to the same Unitarian church in Washington. And their pastors, their successive pastors, are enormously interested in social questions and social justice and in politics, and really believe that the prime purpose, perhaps, of religious faith is for political change. So every week, at least some of these 3 justices are in the pews listening to the same men. So maybe I want to skip through a few of these things, but just as an example of a way I would think about diagnosing the religious influences of the political, or in this case, legal ideas of historical actors. Hugo Black is kind of the best example of this. He's known kind of as the father of modern religion class jurisprudence, and as a quote unquote strict separationist, meaning that he would take Jefferson's interpretation to heart, and that kind of intermingling of religious communities and government functions should be forbidden. Ironically, when he gives conferences to the circuit justices, he starts with a prayer and Bible reading. He's the person who authors this opinion that we can't do that in public schools. A state official isn't allowed to do official prayer, and then continues to do it himself by habit. And going through his correspondence, certainly many people were upset about the prayer ruling, and by many measures, it is the most unpopular Supreme Court ruling in history. Something like Pew Research says something like 85% of Americans at the time thought it was incorrect. Up to that point, the justices has never gotten more correspondence, thinking about volume of correspondence, than for this case. I think Brown was 8 years prior, so the volume of correspondence was much less. So that's interesting. But so Black usually doesn't react or write back to people, but for Engel he does. And he wouldn't say he is obviously often people who would say to him, you're godless or an atheist, or you're making this country godless, et cetera, et cetera. And you would think if he's ruling a-religiously and merely secularly, he might say, here are the reasons based on constitutional law that we have to do this. We live in a pluralist society, et cetera, et cetera. He rarely does that. Usually he is engaged in imminent criticism, meaning he says, no, actually, this is the more Christian ruling. And he cites Matthew 6, where Christ tells the disciples, when you pray to the Father, you should pray in secret. So kind of giving evidence or support to this idea that prayer and religious life should be eminently private. So I'm going to skip through a few things here. One thing that kind of comes up, or a problem, or maybe an opportunity that comes up, if by embracing this kind of Schmittian political theology, saying that the ideas that are ostensibly secular political ideas are in fact at the root of religious ideas, is that the actors that espouse those ideas won't name them as religious themselves. So in some ways, I have to synthesize or even impose upon their thought these categories. And so I would use this phrase in my writing a lot, operational theology, to distinguish between a confessional theology that Hugo Black and others might say outright, I believe X, but to say, how does their writing kind of generate certain principles that we can say were consistent throughout their thought? And so I had to really invent an analytical category to describe what I saw in the mid-century courts, theopolitical leanings. And I borrowed kind of this approach from Christian Smith, who's a sociologist. He's a completely contemporary research. There's this wonderful book called Soul Searching, where he interviewed hundreds of teenagers from across religious denominations and asked them the same questions about belief, their religious belief. And he said, regardless of your religious denomination or religious background, teenagers in America believe some of the same doctrines. And he called this set of beliefs moralistic therapeutic deism, that religion is about being good, that it's about the divine, whatever the divine is about making you happy, and that God or the divine is kind of somewhere out there, up there, and not really involved in life until you ask the Lord to come and give you some therapy. So I kind of borrowed stylistically and methodologically for him. And I said that there's how we can describe the mid-century courts' political theological leanings, we might call syncretic civic moralism. Syncretic, that many of the justices would say that doctrinal particularity, for example, Catholics believe something and Lutherans believe something else, is not important to true religion, and in fact is harmful to democracy. And civic moralism, that the real heart of religious belief is actually good action, regardless of kind of doctrinal, what the court might say, antecedents, and that properly, religion at its essence, it has a civic utilitarianism, that it's useful for democratic life. And that's, in some ways, its purpose. So just kind of showing this in the thought of Harold Burton, who is on the court at the same time as Black and is a dyed-in-the-wool Unitarian. He was once asked to write this little passage for a book about, by a Unitarian press, about why I believe, quote unquote, in liberal religion, whatever that had meant in the 1960s. So he said, the truest possible understanding of God is the best road to peace and progress on earth. That our religious belief is about civil harmony. I regard religious liberalism as but another name for the search for the truth in the field of religion, wherever that truth may be found. That's certainly a Unitarian sentiment, but I would say a syncretic sentiment, that we can find the heart of religion anywhere, in part because the heart of religion is moralism. The golden rule translates all the teachings of all the quote unquote great world religions, which is another bizarre concept, into, or it synthesizes them into civic action. So often I feel like, this is the interesting thing about theory. I felt like I was trying to make an academic buzzword. I don't know if there's any people who've seen this Mean Girls reference. I tell my teacher education students here, the one thing about teaching you should know is that quickly your cultural reference fall on deaf ears and you'll feel old. So anyway, movie quotes are always a risk, but I basically this idea, or is it a helpful synthesis of some real aspect of reality? And of course, the only indications I have is that my dissertation committee said it was okay, and then I had an article published in the Cambridge Journal of Law of Religion, which is one of the major outlets to think about these things, that said it was great. So, in certain ways, I'm trying to make fetch happen. I know I'm kind of running into our question time here. I'll maybe tell us a story about how do I do this. So I did oral history with curriculum developers, and how this became difficult. Or this question of, if I'm trying to synthesize the thought of someone else and to say at its heart, there's a meaning that they might not embrace or claim for themselves. How do I do this? With dead people, that's one thing. With live kind of participants is another. So Lee Arbitman is the head of the street law, which started in the 70s at Georgetown Law as a movement to teach high school kids about their legal rights, and is now kind of this actually international curricular program to teach kids about the law, and high school kids in particular. And so Lee was gracious enough to be an oral history participant. So asking him about the development of his curriculum and his ideas, and going through IRB was hilariously difficult because, of course, the folks at Wisconsin-Madison didn't want me to ask anyone about their religious ideas. So I kind of had to tiptoe around it. And so would ask curriculum developers about the sources of their curriculum and their ideas. And Lee was enormously honest with me, and he said, talking about his own position on religion clause interpretation, he says, I think being Jewish has something to do with it. That because of my religious identity and my religious experience, I'm inclined to interpret these laws in certain ways. And so as a researcher who was interested in essentially the kind of religious influences, in another context we might say biases that shape curriculum, this was gold. Of course, there's some ethical issues in painting someone who agreed not only to be a participant, but who agreed to be de-anonymized in my work, as somehow enforcing their own biases on school children. So the one solution here was, and this is just a quotation from my dissertation work, was to try to push him to give a charitable account of his own life's work. And his idea, or his kind of explanation was, I'm conscious of my own preconceptions or my presuppositions. And because of that, I veered kind of to the other paradigm in presenting or trying to present curriculum as fair and balanced. So it's interesting to think about it. I had another participant who kind of gave me a quote that I felt was fairly damning. And I sent it back to him and I said, is this what you mean? He said, absolutely. And then he gave me one that was even more kind of putting the thumb down on a particular ideology. But so I think there's a lot of open ethical questions, and I'd be interested in what folks think. I think kind of the big questions, I'll end with this, that I'm wrestling with as I prepare this, expand this for publication as a first monograph, is doing intellectual genealogy is interesting, and it's in many ways the most impossible thing, and for me the most exciting. That how do I understand how the ideas of a whole culture change? So trying to do intellectual history with also a nod to social history, and how can we impute ideas to individual people? Those are, I guess, difficult questions. And if I say that, if I take kind of Schmittian political theology as normative, or at least as a guide, does that somehow distort my analysis of history, or of historical actors, or of contemporary actors, or even of myself? And the other question is, all of my writing kind of simply describes what I take to be the religious influences on both legal decisions and then civic education, and without sort of an explicitly evaluative criterion. But I'm sure anyone that reads what I write knows that lurking behind there is a fairly clear opinion about what is good and what is bad. And so it leads me to think, should we is one question, is it possible at all, when we study religion in kind of the contemporary academy, to bracket normative theological questions about, if such and such a religious paradigm is influencing law, is that religious paradigm in fact true, good for human flourishing, etc.? I think there's an analogous kind of debate within Catholic theology about whether a theologian should bring their personal prayer into their work, and kind of the leading figure on the side of yes is Hans Urs von Balthasar. And I just want to include him here because he has his picture with Mickey Mouse at Euro Disney, and I thought that was worth it. So the kind of questions I'm thinking about for my dissertation are all these methodological conundrums and theoretical and ethical ones, as well as sourcing. I think I'm trying to expand to tell a story of how Americans were taught about church and state in this moment. So thinking about kind of big box textbook publishers, advocacy organizations, but also popular media like radio and TV. Kind of looking through the archives, I found a lot about efforts in radio in particular to kind of educate adults and young Americans about these issues. I'll end there. I hope it's been an interesting provocation to think about work. Maybe I'll let kind of David take it from there and see how we want to do questions.
Great. Thanks, Brett. I certainly feel provoked. I think there's a lot of, I have lots doing here. Yeah, folks just want to unmute. If you feel like you're jumping, if you feel it's awkward to jump in at a certain point, you know, happy to have people drop questions in the chat as well. I think it's probably cool just to do per your own feeling, your own sense. Yeah, but I might just ask, yeah, I might just ask quick before Fred here, like, even just if I get the sense right, like it seems to me like you started with kind of more detail, like kind of, you know, these smaller detailed kinds of questions about like what was actually happening in education over this period, how do people actually like develop their ideas, and at least towards the end, and maybe this isn't the end of your project, but was just your presentation, is these like deeper questions about who we are as an American people and how we live together, how we imagine ourselves to be living together, mediated through laws, customs, etc. Do you feel like you're moving into these kind of larger gravity questions? Is that a place you want to be? I mean, those are also, that is maybe kind of more overtly theological as well.
Yeah, that's really helpful for me, David. I think those like maybe foundational questions are the kind that I think about, you know, when I'm making breakfast in the shower. And I think I will be thinking about them until I die or my cognitive ability declines to the point where I'm not, you know, I'm thinking just about breakfast. I think at this point in my intellectual life, I would feel awful trying to take on like questions of first principles. I think I feel much more comfortable hiding hints to how I'm thinking about those things within kind of finer grained historical work. And I think maybe the best example that I think of off my mind, so Carl Kasel is kind of, I don't know, in many ways a flag bearer for our educational policy studies department, the historians, and my classmate and I and Eric Lucky have been doing kind of some work about the uses of history in recent Supreme Court cases having to do with law and religion, education and religion. And Kasel has this masterful history of kind of the origin of common schools or public schools in America. And he has this brief epilogue where he just kind of says, you know, if I were to be a historical actor in this period, I think I would sympathize with the Whigs. And I, you know, just kind of make some broad gestures at what he thinks are important. And as a reader, then you say, okay, I can see that reflected in the historical interpretational decisions he's made. And that's helpful for understanding this is a work of scholarship. But it's a great question, David. I personally don't feel comfortable pontificating about how I think the world should be, but secretly I want to, and I want everyone to believe what I think is right.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, it's great. That's great. I mean, I feel it's sensible, responsible, and clear where you feel like this is where I am. And I also I feel like these kind of deep commitments really do animate us, you know. So it's cool to see you kind of, yeah, I don't know, feel like you're in space that's like alive, but also connected to the big things, but also like there's a kind of good stewardship over the materials you have or over what you've I don't know. But
Thank you.
happy to, yeah, of course. Fred, happy to have you jump in here.
Hi, Brett. This was a really fascinating topic, and it's stimulated a lot of thought on my part. I'm curious whether you have whether you were engaging with the critical literature on secularism at all. I'm thinking of a particular an edited volume called Politics of Religious Freedom. It came out in 2015, and it's edited by Winifred Fowlers Sullivan, Elizabeth Shackman Hurd, Saba Mahmood, and Peter Danchin. And in that collection, there's an essay by Anne Pellegrini on the Everson case. It's called Everson's Children. And Pellegrini makes the argument that that secularism has Protestant content. That the whole idea that Jackson was articulating, that education ought to be for enabling adults to make rational choices and decide on their own beliefs, whereas Catholicism is about indoctrination. That reveals some of the Protestant content behind secularism, and other authors in that collection make that point as well. And I guess I was also interested in just the general your take on the concept of freedom in general, because it seems to me that many of the issues you're raising turn on the conjunction in the First Amendment of the Disestablishment Clause and the Freedom of Expression Clause, which is a constant tension in U.S. jurisprudence, and also in concerns about secularism in the public sphere. So there's that set of issues. Also, I guess I would really want to caution you about using Carl Schmitt. This term political theology that he's got. I know it's sort of seductive, but it seems to me that he's using it as a kind of analogy. That he's saying that political theory addresses the state in much the same manner that theology does God. But Schmitt is not concerned about freedom in any sense. He's thinking about authoritarianism, that the political authority is the one who decides the exception. That's the recipe for it's a theory of authoritarianism, which I don't think is really where you're wanting to go. Just put it out there.
These are really helpful, Fred. Thank you. To the first question, yes, absolutely. I think Winifred Fowler Sullivan is kind of an inspiration for a lot of my thinking, and and I think I actually cite something else by Anne Pellegrini at one point, and I would agree with that assessment that these questions about, and to be honest, that's a very Schmittian critique, that what we think of as liberal democracy is in fact has a substance of Protestant theology, and so as you pointed out very well, that Catholicism or other religious traditions might not be as congenial with the kind of framework of the Constitution as we currently understand it. Maybe I'll talk about Schmitt. I should caution that, or I should maybe give a disclaimer that I think Schmitt has inspired a methodology or a field of study. I think I'm not a methodological determinist. I think the steps he makes after saying that this is a field of inquiry are all things that I would reject. But I simply name him to give credit to kind of the beginnings of a field. And to kind of answer your question about freedom, what is my idea of freedom? I should say, for me, it's a question that I can't divorce from my personal experience, that when I want freedom, it's when I experience true freedom, it's mostly like in the company of friends who affirm. This is going to sound weird and hokey, but it's in the company of friends that affirm my goodness and the goodness of reality, and actually make demands on me, make demands on the way I live together with them. And so personally, my conception of freedom is in many ways completely at odds with any sort of, late 20th century, early 21st century kind of American libertarianist understanding. The interesting questions for me are the Constitution as it's interpreted in 2021 is probably going to be totally foreign to the Constitution as written or ratified in 1787. And I think there's a lot of fruitful work there. The thing that you may know or may not know is within kind of a small circle of Catholic political theorists, there's this hot movement towards integralism. I'm not sure if you've picked up on this or read this, but Adrian Vermeule at Harvard is kind of maybe the ringleader of this sort of thing. And the point is really that it's essentially a Catholic critique of liberalism. And to say that our political imagination as Americans has really been truncated, perhaps in the last 100 years. And that things like pursuing the common good in terms of healthcare and the social welfare state are going to require us to think outside of the typical conception of freedom that has been in operation for at least the last half century.
Yeah, feel free just to jump in. Anyone else?
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate the paper. And by the way, I appreciate the reference to Paul Kahn. I hadn't known about that book. I would make a case for Carl Schmitt, and I think it's appropriate. I'd make 2 points on that. I think when Schmitt talks about our political ideas being secularized theological ideas, he's talking about something deeper than what people think. That the structural arrangements in which we live have theological foundations, and that really has nothing to do with people's theological opinions. So, for example, the big idea for Schmitt is sovereignty. And if you think for 3 seconds about sovereignty, I mean, it's clearly a theological idea and has nothing to do with what anybody thinks, but it's the way we live. I think if you're trying to do freedom from a Schmittian point of view, one person I would recommend, I think it's John Whitty, who heads, I think he still does, the Religion and Law Institute at Emory. He's written a book about theological foundations of the Reformation foundations, in particular, of freedom. Whether he's right about that or not is another matter. But I would affirm the Schmittian approach. I would say this, and maybe this is parallel. I don't think the 2016 and 2020 were about theological ideas or religious ideas. I think they're about ersatz religious and theological ideas. I think that, number one, I mean, you've mentioned Niebuhr. I mean, name now a prominent American public intellectual who's a theologian. I mean, a serious public intellectual who's a theologian. I don't think there are any. I mean, I'm open to being educated. I think what you're looking at in 2016 and 2020 is theology as a pretext for rights talk. Theology is a pretext for rights talk. And the rights talk comes from the Declaration, and it comes from actually, I might say, a superficial vision of the Declaration, where, and I'm thinking about Protestants on the Christian right, where Protestants take the Declaration as the occasion for a theological affirmation of their rights. And consequently, they completely misunderstand their own Christian roots, because the foundational text for a Protestant political theology would be Romans 13. And Romans 13, of course, is highly authoritarian. So I think that fits with my comment about Schmitt, which is to say, a lot of people talking about theology today are really talking about ersatz theology. Frankly, to quote our Nobel Prize winner, you had no faith to lose and you know it. You say you lost your faith, but that's not where it's at. You had no faith to lose and you know it. So just those observations. I think finally, one final point in looking for categories, it struck me that, C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, which frankly I view as fraudulent, but I think might be a helpful that is a non-dogmatic Christianity where we can all come together and hold hands and sing Kumbaya. But thank you for your paper.
Carl, this is wonderful. Would you mind saying a little bit more about Lewis? I think when I was trying to do with syncretic civic moralism is say, here's an operative theology that's shared by people across religious traditions. I would say even Arthur Goldberg, who is Reformed Jewish, would kind of hold these same sort of things. It seems that Lewis's project is evangelical, not in the descriptive sense, but in its purpose. He's giving a talk to Brits following the war on the radio to convince them that Christianity, in kind of historically orthodox, but then in all of its differentiation, is worth pursuing. Whereas what I'm trying to do is kind of a backdoor labeling diverse people as actually agreeing with each other. I don't know if I have a coherent thought here, but I'm really interested to hear what you're thinking on the C.S. Lewis lines.
Well, that raises larger questions for me. In my misspent youth, I got a PhD in English literature, and I wrote my dissertation on Edmund Spenser. And as you may know, C.S. Lewis rescued Edmund Spenser from the ash heap of history. Lewis is primarily a Spencer scholar in his day job. I think Mere Christianity is fraudulent. I think the attempt to, and maybe to give some of my personal theological orientation, I would think about Karl Barth. Of course, Hans Urs von Balthasar wrote about Karl Barth, Catholic writing about Barth. Catholic with whom I might have some sympathy. I think the evangelical homogenization has been destructive. It's been ignorant. It's fostered ignorance. It's fostered, and in fostering ignorance, it has fostered intolerance. And I think it's a mistake. I don't know. I mean, those are my views. And maybe I'd return to Schmidt. Schmidt is talking about something real. I mean, whether we like it or not, and whether we agree with him or not. Politically, I'm a liberal. But whether we agree with him or not, sovereignty exists. I mean, if I get stopped for speeding, I'm not going to argue with the cop about, whether he has any authority over me or not. I'm going to shut up and pay the fine, but and take my points. But Schmidt is talking about real things in our common political experience that secularism cannot explain, and that have their origins in our theological traditions. And now, and it is true that Schmidt is interested in the authoritarian. He's interested in a critique of the liberal state. But the liberal state, the Protestant, there may be a Protestant response to Schmidt, but I don't think anybody's really. I mean, Whitty may be. I mean, there are people. I don't want to say nobody. But I mean, frankly, that's not terribly helpful. But that's what I think.
Oh, it is helpful. Thank you.
By the way, Brett, I might just say I did about 5 years ago. I wrote about a book about Calvin, really in political theology, and I'll send you a copy.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Wow.
So Brett, listening to your talk, I I thought about putting this in a historical perspective or a historical context a little bit more. So the period you're looking at is ripe with searching for some sort of a regulative normative idea. So it's the time of the Judeo-Christian tradition. So Will Herberg writes Protestant Catholic Jew and says, well, they're all different, but they all adhere to the same set of values, which are American values. And he comes up with the idea of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Eisenhower uses this, where he apparently makes some extempore comments. What popped in my mind is that Abraham Joshua Heschel in No Religion is an Island talked about the common enemy is nihilism, he says. So it's where there is a type of value relativism. So when everything can be traded for anything. What popped in my mind is Locke, who in his letters, or first letter on toleration, said the taking away of God dissolves all. So there is a certain tradition which, democracy can only work if there's something that transcends, that provides some foundation and at the same time transcends democracy. What I haven't, and you then talk about Unitarians, or pointed out that these are Unitarians, they go to church, come up with this idea of civic, syncretic moralism. But that, of course, is a certain period. And I'm curious how that translates to the 21st century. And I mean, you had former Attorney General Barr on the picture, now Supreme, the new Supreme Justice. Those, of course, are grounded in a very Catholic tradition. What I would like to hear from you, how you kind of have these different regulative ideas kind of relating to each other. We're not all Catholic, we're not all Protestant. Might be easier for Unitarians in the 50s to come up with this syncretic moralism. It's much harder in the 21st century. I'm fond of Heschel as a thinker, and there is some truth that nihilism, if nothing counts, then it's pretty hard to come up with any normative ideas, any democratic values we all adhere to. But how does it translate these ideas? How do they translate to the 21st century? I'd like to hear something from you on that.
Yeah, and I apologize. I'm cutting into my late night office hours, so I might have to go after this question. But I teach at night and I let the students come in before. But this is brilliant, Ulrich. So you kind of wrote my first chapter. So I was really interested in kind of Bella's concept of civil religion. And I kind of framed this moment of crisis for the court in the sense that there was kind of this pan-Protestant civil religion that was trying to be replaced with Will Herberg's Catholic Protestant Jew. And then the 62 decision was trying to introduce a new civil religion that Americans had just gotten used to, this Judeo-Christian synthesis, which I agree with you. I met with Philip Hamburger, who is kind of a legal historian, and he was really generous, but I remember him saying, well, have you ever met a Judeo-Christian? As if to say, this is certainly a fabricated category. But I think Americans after the war were just getting used to this, and there was a lot of energy behind it. Even like the Brotherhood of Christians and Jews, there were these fraternal organizations built on this new idea. And then the court kind of says, there's folks outside that category, and we have to have this more expansive category, and people didn't buy that. I think just to clarify, like my diagnosis of syncretic civic moralism, just like Christian Smith's diagnosis of moralistic therapeutic deism in the 20th century or early 21st century, is not an affirmation of it. I think the synthesis was unstable, insufficient. Certainly, so their question, actually, this is super clarifying for me. I believe that it doesn't last, it doesn't even last 2 decades. It's just the kind of attempt at consensus is totally unstable and unsuccessful. And we have nothing to fill the gap. So the idea of, I mean, maybe it's a perennial difficulty with pluralism, is and this is what Rousseau is trying to do when he invents the category of civil religion, is we have this group of people that need something unifying that's very deep and integrated into the human experience and their deepest longings. But in a religiously hyper-plural society, we don't have that. And so does democracy work? I think what Carl said this pretty well, maybe what you've seen in the last 2 election cycles is simply the fact that we don't have that anymore. And I would say that, ironically, this attempt in the mid-century by the court and other actors to piece together a unifying civil religion by flattening all sorts of doctrinal divergence weakens Americans across denominations, weakens Americans' understanding of religion itself as something private, something not to be shared, and that's something that doesn't have anything to do with building institutions. I think we're very good at, maybe I'll end with this, we're very good at bringing religion into public debate to score points and to talk about things we like. We're less good as Americans at allowing religious convictions to help us build institutions that support, like this is the role of civil society that, Tocqueville would say we're dearly missing, but just to support people materially. That's not an adequate answer, but I really appreciate the question, Ulrich, because it's helped me clarify kind of what I'm trying to do here.
Yeah, civil religion, I was waiting for you to say that, but then the question, of course, is what's civil religion in the 21st century? And it's the symbolism. So I'm thinking of Donald Trump holding a Bible in front of a church while their Black Lives Matter marches in DC, and he's using the military to kind of hold the rallies. So it's or is about to. But is that civil? I mean, that is using brutal force and claiming the executive power as president of America. I mean, is that a civil religion? Or is there a different concept that is pluralistic, kind of per se per definitionem?
Yeah. Adam, were you going to jump in there?
No, I was turning up the volume. I'm wondering if we do have time for a question, or whether you have to go. I don't want to get.
There's no have tos. There's only consequences. So ask the question.
Okay. First of all, I want to apologize for having to come in late. So I didn't catch the first part of the talk, but I did have the pleasure of reading the first version of this project in dissertation form. So I have a basic idea of what it's about. And if you haven't had a chance to read the dissertation, it's terrific in itself. Just a second, I might have to answer a question. Somebody else might jump in. Sorry about this.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say Ulrich, and I hope I can identify it on my bookshelf here. Here we go. I'm going to show you the America's civil religion here. This is maybe the favorite book I've read in the last 10 years. Catherine Loftus, Oprah, the Gospel of an Icon. So she's a historian of American religion, but kind of as a post-dissertation project, decided to use all her methodological tools watch 2 years worth of Oprah. And really, it's really fascinating. So I think, that's tongue in cheek, but I do think the sort of cheap thrills that I get every night when I go home and watch streaming video services are sort of binds, in the kind of religio sense of religion, binds Americans more than anything else. Whether that's good or bad is another, it's bad, but.
So I'll jump in very briefly with my question, and if I only have time to ask it and then we move on, that's totally fine. One of the things that I really like about your project is thinking about the ways you frame the justices and so on as the actors who are presenting themselves as religious figures, or are taking on religious rhetoric, or are playing quasi-religious roles with prayers before things they do at events and so on. But of course, there are also ways in which unwittingly the public makes them their religious adjudicators or religious disputes, or places them in a religious role that they might not necessarily be choosing for themselves. And sometimes when I'm thinking of the way the court dealt with religious questions very early on, it was rarely around trying to decide the role of religion in public life. It was usually churches as corporations, or what is the institutional sort of rights and responsibilities of churches as corporate bodies and things like that. And so one of the things that I was thinking about as I was hearing you talk tonight was just about the ways in which the judges who figure so prominently as characters in your story dealt with the responsibilities placed on them to make decisions that had theological consequences for Americans as citizens and believers, even if that's not the framework that, as judges, they necessarily see themselves working in. In other words, their decisions will be interpreted and will have consequences theologically for Americans, but they're not necessarily, how do I want to even put that? They're not choosing that framework for themselves as judges.
This is
and
brilliant.
What I think you're arguing in a lot of the story is, yes, they are, because as our discussion today has emphasized, the law is a religious exercise in many ways. It has religious roots. The structures of the law institutionally have religious roots, and so on and so forth. And yet they sometimes, then and now, bend over backwards to claim that that's not where their decisions are coming from.
Yeah, this is brilliant. Thank you, Adam. Maybe I'll share two thoughts, and then I probably should go. This has been wonderful. One was, I think, to your question, I wonder if some of them there is a reluctance to take on a role that, for a variety of reasons, is forced on them, and I really am going to think through that. I really appreciate that. For others, I think, and it would depend on personality, I think William Douglas really wanted to have this role. That he saw himself, even from, and I think Rehnquist in a similar way, from young men, saw themselves as larger than life leaders that would determine the course of history and relish that. Of course, and this is the other story I'll share. Through kind of a program through Catholic University, the summer that I was doing some dissertation research in the Library of Congress, I had the chance to have like a little, I want to say an audience, it seems like a papal audience, with Justice Scalia, or not Scalia, excuse me, Alito. And I asked him this question. It was kind of a tongue-in-cheek question. The Ruth Bader Ginsburg biopic had just come out, and it was in theaters and a big hit. And you could walk into the Supreme Court bookstore and get all this kind of Ruth Bader Ginsburg merchandise in the bottom of the court. And so I asked him, maybe it was a tongue-in-cheek question, but I asked him kind of, what do you think of the kind of celebrity, or how do you deal with the celebrity that becoming a justice is? And he said, I think it's really a problem. Not that the court members themselves are able to control that, but he said it's a problem for democracy. But then he said, for some reason, he's immune to it. He's a big baseball fan. He was at a minor league baseball game, and he's just walking around the stands, and someone comes up to him and says, "Hey, I know who you are." He says, "Yeah." He says, "You're my ex-wife's divorce lawyer." and just Leo said, "I just said, yes, I'm sorry." And I just kept walking. So, it might depend on the justice, but I that's a really fruitful avenue for exploration, is in what ways structures and social expectations have placed them in this position where they are high priests in a certain way, that they do get to decide certain things.
At least he didn't say, "You're the associate youth pastor at my mega church," or something like that.
Alito doesn't give up that vibe, but well, I should probably run. So I do want to thank David and Ulrich especially, and all of you for your questions and your time, and also, your mentorship while I was at Wisconsin. I just really, really grateful.
Brett, we're very grateful for you to share with us. This was great. I know for myself, my graduate work is in theology. So whenever I get to kind of even just have the words uttered, I'm animated. So
Wonderful.
Thank you all. Yeah, we'll be in touch here. This is our last talk for the fall. So stay tuned in the future here. Brett, it was a pleasure. One last round of applause for Brett today. Yep. Look forward to the monograph, or the 3 monographs that you have forecasted in your future here. So
we're planning for 1, but thank you, and have a great end of the semester, everybody.
See you, everybody. Take care.